and other are coming on Catholic nationalism. And we are looking forward to hearing to your lecture on the crusade between memorial activation and reenactment, sacrifice, war, and the brutalization of enemy in the 19th century. Nice title, by the way.
Very long title. Thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Francisco Javier for his kind invitation, the Fernando Catholic Institution, and all those who collaborate in the organization of this very interesting conference. My talk today aims to explore what seems to me an important dimension of the historical relationship between the memory of intolerance and sacred violence in the 19th century. Following Maurice Holbach's work, reread by Daniela Deleger, religion could be considered from the point of view of memory and of religious memory as a mémoire de combat. From this point of view, the Christian or Catholic religion can be seen as a particular way of activating remembrance, which makes it possible to ensure the continuity of the message through the succession of generation of believers, and to assert its absolute and unchanged relevance in social and cultural conditions that never cease to change. As Jan Hasman argued, the German Egyptologist, in every culture, what establishes the foundations of belonging and identity is the connective structure that binds individuals together. This structure is based on the bond of common rules and values on one hand, and on the memory of a shared past on the other. Thus, all rites, for example, possess this double aspect of repetition and actualization. Cultural memory acts as an orienting force for a group in a given situation. Its composition results from the need of meaning and the reference frames of present. It can be revolutionary when memory becomes expectation, but expectation is not an exclusive attribute of revolutionary modernity. And memory does not only create community. By reactivating mechanism of distinction between the us and the others, it may contribute to create new conflicts, as we are seeing, as we will see today and tomorrow, and new divisions inside communities, including forms of intolerance. All these considerations, for me, apply very well to the history of the Crusades after the Crusades. The Crusade lexicon now belongs to our public communication and has undergone a process of banalization. As an ideology, the Crusade would provide a sacred covering to the use of war violence. Scholars such as Elisabeth Sibéry, Mike Horswell have traced contemporary culture's fascination with medieval expeditions to the Holy Hand, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world. More recently, Daniele Menozzi, an Italian historian, has dedicated a wide-ranging study to a detailed reconstruction of the stages through which the category of crusade has been resemantized in Catholic culture. My purpose today is partly different and more restricted. I will try to retrace the concrete ways in which the memory of the medieval crusades has been reactivated at the dawn of contemporary times as a cultural device that was able to give meaning to political and religious struggles in Europe. In particular, I'm not interested here in telling the story of a concept or of a word, but to compare forms of memory and forms of engagement. It is not to study what crusade is in contemporary times, but to show how it acts and affects religious cultures. In so doing, I will focus on two main contexts: of memorial re-emergence, reactivation, and concrete mobilization of this idea of crusade, the counter-revolutionary period and the national or romantic one. Both these contexts belong to the origins of the modern recovery of the idea of crusade and are also characterized by the European rather than extra-European dimension of their use. So an history inside Europe. It is well known, so I come from my first point. It is well known that the Enlightenment discredited the idea and the institution of crusades as an ideology. French Revolution changed everything. Crusade, once again, was considered as a model for military action in the contemporary world. It belonged to the counter-revolutionary movements and cultures to baptize this reactivation of crusades in modern time. And all this took place both as a memorial recovery and as a concrete actualization of a specific time of war conflict, namely a military expedition proclaimed by the ecclesiastical authority and providing spiritual rewards for the participants in exchange of their commitment to a fight against the enemy of the faith. In 1794, a Spanish Jesuit emigrant in Italy, Francisco Gustave, published anonymously, first anonymous and then with his name in Ferrara, within the Papal States, a pamphlet titled Critical Essay on Crusades. The subtitle summarized its context and purpose. I quote, "If is the commonly established idea on them, on crusades, right, and if are they adaptable to the present circumstances with a few changes?" Father Gustave answer to his own first question was a negative one. The second, affirmative. The Jesuits' position was dictated by the consideration that the radical nature of the conflict in France calls for extraordinary means. Indeed, the new threat was even more dangerous than that of the infidel Muslims, because the revolutionaries, heirs of the philosophe, are threatening the very survival of religion. Just one simple quote, a quotation. "God wills it," he wrote. "We can most reasonably exclaim in the present circumstances that the people should harm themselves against the common enemy." Gustave's conviction was that Catholic religion still had a great influence on the population, despite of the efforts of the incredulous philosophe. As a result, the call to crusade could be an effective response to the revolutionary Levian mass. In fact, a certain admiration for revolutionary mobilization is, we can find this admiration in Gustave's argument. As he wrote, I quote, "Mass conscription was the plan devised and largely executed by the Jacobins, making themselves formidable for their enemies." Indeed, the crusade was a better answer to revolutionary mobilization, as it would be based on spontaneous popular adherence rather than on forced conscription. As a result, crusade opposite mass of people against other mass. I quote Gustave. And in order to make the war truly holy and religious, the intervention of the Roman pontiff was necessary. In Gustave's ultramontane mentality, it was up to the sovereigns to beg the Pope to open the enlistment with the granting of indulgences, and to the bishops and clergy to call the people to arms, to bless their words and crosses, and to comfort them in the middle of danger. The proposal was also attentive to the symbols to be mobilized. just another quotation, the last one. Let them raise a banner and wave in the air an embroidered crucifix in which the ranks may see the reason of their battles and the prize of victories. So the practice of issuing the Bulla de Crusada was still alive in the second half of the 18th century as an annual custom to distributing indulgences to finance the fight against Muslims. And during the World Convention, some Spanish bishops and clergymen, as we will see, pushed for a qualification of the fight against the French as a crusade, brandishes the cross as a sign of ushered victory. On the other hand, ultramontane circles in Rome accepted Gustav's proposal and tried to have it adopted by the Holy See. After the descent of the revolutionary armies into Italy and the occupation of the northern territories of the ecclesiastical state, the King of Naples and the Emperor of Austria explicitly asked the Pope to declare a war of religion. The answer was possibilist but cautious. Papal authorities were only too aware of the risks involved in an operation which they considered, they did take in serious consideration above all. The danger of drenching the papacy into a struggle between factions and thus generating internal unrest, first and foremost in France, was very important. Pressure from ultramontane circle led to the presentation of a votum, an advice to Pius VI. The text did advocate the necessity of the crusade as a relief for the evils of the day, so that the weapon of holy war may be holy. I will not read the entire citation and just take it on the PowerPoint presentation. Even this new request was not accepted by the Pope, who in the meantime experienced imprisonment and exile from the Eternal City. But this kind of prescriptions, you can see in the PowerPoint presentation, is a very exactly prescriptions to with a plan of crusade or reenactment of a crusade. Did not fail, this kind of prescription, to be put into practice in the numerous insurgent actions that punctuated southern Europe during the revolutionary and Napoleonic age. The battle under the banner of the cross was the catchword of the counter-revolutionary army gathered, for example, in Calabria, south of Italy, by the cardinal and politician Fabrizio Ruffo in February 1799, the so-called Sanfedismo in Italy. Ruffo's army called itself Christian and Royal Army, but was well known also as the Army of the Holy Faith. Cardinal Ruffo explicitly asked permission to the King Minister, Lord Acton, King of Naples, to mix in the uniforms and flags some religious signs, such as the cross, the image of the Virgin Mary, or the initials of Jesus Christ, so as to make the purpose of the expedition and the assurance of divine support visible to the masses. Arriving in the city of Crotone in Calabria, the cardinal performed an opposite ritual, planting a cross with his own hands where the superstitious tree of chimerical freedom, as a chronicle noted, had been raised. So, cross against tree of liberty. The whole campaign was marked by the brutalization of the political and religious enemy, referred to as the furious French Masonade, the abominable sect of Jacobites. Here you are some example. Ruffo himself had to confess that he was unable to curb the impulses of his volunteer troops, who indulged in pillage and revenge even to the extreme act of cannibalism. In Spain, too, the reactivation of crusade was as material and practical as a theoretical one. The Partida de Cruzada were groups of fighters, being almost all them members of the clergy, that was organized following Napoleon's occupation of the Iberian Peninsula. Clerics engaged themselves in writing clear regulations in order to shape this militia. The most famous regulation was perhaps the first composed by Friar Manuel Traggia, a discalced Carmelite, named also Miguel de Santo Tomas. Here you are, the most entire list of these regulations, which I could find in, this is interesting. I find this in a manuscript in the archives in Turin, because this type of regulation circulated in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. This was the archive of Balbo di Vinario, the father of Cesare Balbo, a Catholic essayist and historian, Catholic historian, most important in Italy, and he was ambassador in Spain after the Napoleonic War. Even if this project was not successful, other similar projects were conceived starting from 1809. The organization of the Partida de Cruzada by Friar Juan Ferrer de Jesus y Maria held the same precision in describing the uniform of the crusader. Podrían usar de calzón y chupa de paño negro o azul oscuro con los vivos, vuelta y colarín rojo y con una cruz roja en la izquierda. Indeed, groups of crusaders were formed in several provinces such as Galicia, Catalonia, Andalusia, and so on. These clergymen, these guerrilleros, elaborated their action plans and military regulation with the aim of presenting them to the Supreme Central Junta that met on September 1808 as a patriotic alternative to the French administration. It was not a coincidence that some of the authors of these crusade plans openly asked the Suprema Junta to consult theologians and canonists in order to state the legitimacy of clergymen that, I quote, matan o mutilan en esta guerra de religión. So I'm not interested in establishing the exact number of religious guerrillas mobilized during these years of conflict. Neither I want to get into the historiographic myth of the Spanish fighting clergy. What I would like to highlight is the emergence of a language of crusade in this context and the meanings it takes on. In one of the first attestations of the term cruzada, a document drawn up in Badajoz in 22 April 1809 and sent to the Junta Central, we can read that the formation of armed forces was literally considered a levia mas, el alarma general, endowed with religious character. His effective means was justified by the outrage that the French armies directed at the sacred and profane objects of the kingdom. In Spain too, so the religious character imposed to the fight was thus translated into mobilizing symbols such as the red cloth cross to be placed on the chest of the volunteers. Crusada was a holy war in the sense of religious war, a war between true Catholics and patriots on one side and heretics and afrancesados on the other one. The combat was not only a political, but mainly a religious or confessional one. The struggle between true believers and the false one. In the mind of clerics, as the French Revolution was a consequence of Protestant reform, political rebellion was the other phase of religious rebellion. As Manuel Traja again deeply wrote, Guerra Santa y de Cruzada y religión es lo mismo en la sustancia, y solo significa que defendemos las leyes divinas, el dogma, el culto exterior, la iglesia, los vasos santos, sus ministros, las costumbres y la moral. In this way, the Spanish Cruzadas were the late avatars of medieval crusades against heretics, but was also a new struggle against enlightenment and its cultural influence in modern society. As in Italy, it was also unavoidably a civil war, a struggle between Spanish people and other Spanish people who accepted French occupation. In the language of the sources, the crusade is the most appropriate symbolic form to represent the clash of religion and civilization with the French occupier. As Gregorio Alonso argued, crusade discourse in Spain during Napoleonic occupation played an important role in shaping a Catolicismo de combate. The call for combat was at least 15 years old and developing the anti-enlightenment discourse of clerics such as Friar Diego José de Cádiz that called for an holy war, namely a war of religion against revolutionary armies during the Guerra de la Convención in 1793. Spain, for these Catholic clerics, was a new Holy Land, and her identity rested on the sacrifice of their martyrs for the faith. As a long list of pamphlets, sermons, posters, and other ephemeral writings of the time did not cease to repeat. So let's sum up. The crusade as a war of religion, obligation of sacrifice and martyrization of the fighters for a struggle judged as a sacred, and the consequent brutalization of the enemies. All these elements were mobilized far and wide in Southern Europe at the height of the revolutionary age. What I will suggest is that all these appeals to the Holy War are pieces of a larger context, which imply a broader historical background, both diachronic and synchronic. It displayed a language and a mental set that was not entirely unprecedented. In his monumental thesis on violence at the time of the religious struggles in France, Denis Crusade stressed the sacred value of Catholic violence. Acts of violence were cultural expression constituting different answers to a phenomenon of collective panic. Thus, Crusade's imagery worked as a cultural device that makes violence paroxysms possible, because it gains sense in the fulfillment of the end of times. In a similar way, French medievist Philippe Buc connects this logic of holy war to the Christian tension between eschatology and exegesis, a tension that Christianity bequeathed to post-Christian societies and cultures. Certainly, the Spanish Crusade and the Crusade-shaped insurgencies during the revolutionary period witnessed of other times and other initiatives. Even if a millenarian mentality was at work at the end of the 18th century, and it affected both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary cultures, collective pain and terror did not deal with the salvation of the soul or predestination. After some decades in which we didn't stop, quite rightly, to emphasize the so-called sacralization of politics and the development of secular religions, the ideological and material reactivation of the crusade myth by intransigent clergymen put us in front, I believe, of a more ambiguous landscape. It is a reality in which members of the traditional religion deeply rejected the religious pluralism and disenchantment following the end of religious wars. They reinvented and reimagined an ancient device of holy violence in order to give an effective form to the mobilization against the new sects marching all around Europe with revolutionary Libyan knights. As the revolutionaries put on the clothes of ancient Romans and Athenians or Spartans, acts that Karl Marx mocked some years later, the counter-revolutionary actors dressed up its champions as crusaders. Now I come to the second part of my speech, because meanwhile, Catholic cultures and Romantic movements rediscovered and revitalized a mythical vision of the medieval Christendom, including the history of the Crusades. No one witnessed this process of, which I may call a process of profane rediscovery of the sacred, more than the true refound of contemporary Catholicism. I mean, René de Chateaubriand, who deployed three decisive elements in restructuring the imagery of the Crusade in the 19th century: the figure of sacrifice and martyrdom in his romance Les Martyrs, the journey to Jerusalem in his Itinéraire de Paris à Jérusalem, and the chivalric epic praised in his Génie du Christianisme. One of his friends did even much more. Joseph-François Michaud was a journalist and a bibliophile for a living and a legitimist in politics. His interest in the expeditions to the Holy Land came from the reading of a novel by Sophie Cottin-Resto, which told a romance set during the Third Crusade. Michaud provided an historical introduction to the novel, and from this first commitment, he developed a tireless interest on the subject and led him to become a historian. Begun in 1807, his Histoire des Crusades was published in 7 volumes between 1811 and 1822. And all the rest of his life, he collected an enormous amount of documents. From the beginning, Michaud's purpose was to advocate the civilizing effect of crusades upon Western civilization, in particular France. Thus, the Histoire des Crusades contributed to the Romantic fascination with Orientalism and in displaying Christianity as a force capable of unifying Europe once again. Michaud's history was a more practical, engaged one. At the end of the 5th volume of his Histoire, he published the list of contributors to collections organized by Catholic legitimist circles to help Christians in Lebanon and Syria, the so-called Crusade de Charité. The mobilization of French Catholics was opposite to the parallel liberal mobilization for the liberation of Greece at the beginning of the 20s, forming an ideological competition on the common ground of the reactivation of the idea of the crusade. Anyway, Michaud's account proved to be enormously popular. It went through 4 editions under the Restoration, 5 editions appeared under the July Monarchy, and it will continue to be published throughout the 19th century, including the 1 edition illustrated by Gustave Doré. It was translated in many languages and also in Italian tongue. It provided a model to attribute a civilizing mission interwoven in the memory of the Holy Wars for other European nations. The First Crusade, in particular, was depicted as the glory of our fathers and the noblest source of patriotism. This model found fertile ground, especially in Italy. The memorial reactivation of the idea of the crusade took on particular accent in Italian peninsula, helping to spread the figure of martyrdom and sacrifice in a new view of holy war strongly linked to national independence, as it was in Spain at the beginning of the century. The memory of the First Crusade became a subject of intense cultural work, which writers, artists, often directly involved in the struggles for Italian national independence, participated too, plundering the great repertoire provided by the show. The painter Francesco Hayez, a romantic painter from Milan, illustrated with a series of lithographs a long poem by another romantic writer, Tommaso Grossi, which titled The Lombards of the First Crusade, I Lombardi alla Prima Crociata. And in the same years, dedicated one of his most successful paintings, which we can see there, to the preaching of Peter the Hermit on the First Crusade. A few years later, Hayez produced another canvas in which Peter the Hermit was planted by Pope Urban II. It depicted the moment when the friar waved the cross beside the pontiff in the square of Clermont on 27 November 1095. Besides, the war culture of Italian patriotism had developed another narrative that drew on the medieval past, but not only crusades, namely the episodes of the Lombard League of the 20th century as an epic tale of the resistance of the communes, of Italian communes, to the Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa under papal leadership. The revival of the Battle of Legnano and the Oath of Pontida as historical exemplar of national redemption against foreign domination was one of the founding myths of the Italian Risorgimento. Piedmontese Marquis Massimo d'Azeglio dedicated, you can just get a look to the canvas, depicted a large painting to the episode of the Battle of Legnano, which saw the victory of the Italian communes, the Italian League. And you can see the carroccio, the chariot in the middle with the cross, is the symbol of the unity of the Italian League. Now, in Italian political culture, these two different narratives dovetailed each other. So you have Crusades and you have the Lombard League. And they opened up the patriotic imagery to a more universal and religious dimension represented by the expedition to the Holy Land, because it make able to turn a local episode in national history, the Battle of Legnano, to a figure of holy war legitimized by papal sanction. And the fact is that these connections were very much in the minds of mid-19th century patriots, as the clash with Austrian Empire approached. At the outbreak of the revolution of 1848, many people have wondered, in the words of a pamphleteer who was a papal subject, whether a quote why will not a holy crusade be awakened? A crusade which must free the church from its shackles and the nation from its slavery? The answer must be positive, because, I quote, Italy will win because it is Catholic, because whoever is with God, God is with him. End quotation. What made this shift possible was the intervention of the figure of Pius IX as a catalyst in a neo-Guelphic declination for the narrative rivulets that national patriotic literature had to offer. Indeed, the main and most imagined role played by the Roman pontiff was the most striking feature of the 1848 reactivation of Crusades. The new reformist policy inaugurated by Giovanni Maria Mastai Terretti, the Pope of Pius IX, after his election in June 1846, raised great expectation in Italian and European population. Very soon, this emotional investment on the Pope's charismatic virtues, was triggered a call for holy war. Massimo d'Azeglio, the painter and writer, wrote in March 1847, "I seem to hear again the terrible God will state of the Crusades." And in 1948, after the uprising of the springtime of peoples, several thousand men and women mobilized and took up arms against regular armies in the conviction that their commitment was a divine command that overrode even that of their parents. The guarantee of the holiness of that command came from the conviction that the Pope himself had blessed the national cause. After the outbreak of the War of Italian independence between Piedmont and Austria on 23 March 1848, some ecclesiastical lectors, such as the Barnabite Alessandro Gavazzi, credited a direct blessing of the flags of the Roman volunteers by Pius IX. This is a lithograph, and it was also a piece of propaganda at the moment. But these episodes of obvious overinterpretation are, in my view, pretty superfluous in the face of the imposing and simultaneous mobilization of laity and ecclesiastics in those months. I think it is more interesting here to analyze, and this is the last point of my presentation, the forms of reactivation of the language of the Crusades in order to explore their meanings and values. Firstly, the Germans, that is how Italian patriots called the Austrians, were associated with barbarians, savage tyrants, who threatened both the virtue of Italian women, and therefore the nation as a whole, and the religion. In a military general order to the papal troops gathered in Bologna by always Massimo d'Azeglio, the Piedmontese marquis explicitly